The Spanish Civil War was not just a struggle for power. It was a battleground for the future of Spain, shaped by deep-seated social, political, and religious divisions. In many ways, the war was a reflection of the larger ideological conflicts that were spreading across Europe during the early 20th century. The fate of a nation was determined by a clash between ideologies, from the rise of fascism to the fervent struggle for social revolution. But what really ignited this devastating war that would claim the lives of hundreds of thousands? Let's step back and look at the complex background and causes that led to the Spanish Civil War, where history, religion, and political ideology converged to tear the nation apart. Welcome to the War Vault. In this video, we'll explore the intricate web of circumstances that gave birth to the Spanish Civil War, a conflict that not only reshaped Spain, but also had lasting repercussions on the political landscape of Europe. Background and causes of the Spanish Civil War, 1936 to or, which raged from 1936 to 1939, wasn't born from a single cause. It emerged from a series of deep-seated issues that had been simmering in Spanish society for decades. The political, social, and economic landscape of Spain in the early 20th century was far from stable. To understand the causes of the war, it's necessary to examine the historical, ideological, and religious tensions that had been mounting for years. The political and social landscape of Spain. At the start of the 20th century, Spain was a deeply divided country. Its political structure was unstable, and the monarchy was in decline. King Alfonso XIII, who ruled Spain until 1931, failed to address the growing dissatisfaction among the population. Spain had been a relatively minor player in Europe's imperial ambitions during the 19th century, losing most of its colonies in the Spanish-American War of '8. The loss of these territories further exacerbated feelings of national decline, and there was a growing desire for change. By the early 1930s, Spain had become increasingly polarized, with the social divide between the rich and the poor growing ever wider. Economic inequality was rampant, and rural areas were particularly suffering. Industrialization had failed to reach many parts of the country, and peasants faced exploitation. Meanwhile, the urban working class was increasingly radicalized, influenced by socialist and anarchist ideas spreading across Europe. In 1931, Spain's monarchy was abolished, and the Second Spanish Republic was established. This marked a significant shift in the political system, as it represented a move towards democracy and modernization. However, this change didn't solve Spain's problems. Instead, it only deepened divisions. The Republic struggled to gain legitimacy, facing opposition from conservative elements of Spanish society, including the military, landowners, and the Catholic Church. Ideological polarization. The rise of radical movements. The 1930s saw the rise of ideologies that had been gaining ground in Europe. The economic instability, coupled with the harsh social conditions, provided fertile ground for the spread of radical political movements. On the left, socialist, communist, and anarchist groups grew in strength, advocating for workers' rights, social justice, and the redistribution of wealth. These movements were particularly powerful in industrial areas like Catalonia and the Basque Country, where large urban working classes were demanding change. On the right, conservative and monarchist factions were deeply opposed to the Republic's secular and left-wing policies. These groups were supported by a coalition of landowners, industrialists, and military officers who feared the growing power of the left. The Catholic Church, which had long been a powerful institution in Spain, aligned itself with these conservative elements, viewing the secular republic as a threat to its influence. The Church's role in Spanish society, particularly its control over education and social institutions, was a major point of contention in the political struggle. The political climate of Spain became increasingly volatile during the 19th. The Republic was beset by frequent changes of government, political instability, and economic crises. There were frequent strikes and uprisings, particularly in the industrial north. In 1934, a series of left-wing uprisings, known as the October Revolution, were brutally suppressed by the government. This further alienated the left from the Republic and pushed more people toward revolutionary ideologies. The role of religion, the Church and the nationalist. Religion played a significant role in the lead-up to the Spanish Civil War. Spain had been a staunchly Catholic country for centuries, and the Catholic Church was a central figure in its political and social life. The Church had long aligned itself with conservative and monarchist forces, and it viewed the rise of the Republic with deep suspicion. The secular policies of the new republic, including land reforms, the reduction of the Church's influence, and the promotion of religious tolerance, angered many within the clergy. The Church's alignment with the Nationalists during the Civil War was a key factor in the conflict. The Nationalists, led by General Francisco Franco, promised to restore the power of the Church and protect Spain's traditional Catholic values. For many Catholics, the war was seen as a battle to defend their faith against the secularism and anti-clericalism of the left. In contrast, the Republicans were often seen as hostile to the Church. Many Republican factions, particularly the anarchists and communists, were secular and even atheistic. The Church was one of their primary targets, and during the early years of the war, thousands of priests, nuns, and other religious figures were killed by Republican forces. This persecution of the clergy further fueled the narrative that the war was a religious struggle, with the Nationalists cast as the defenders of Catholicism, the economic divide, rural versus urban Spain. Another crucial factor in the Spanish Civil War was the stark economic divide between rural and urban Spain. Rural areas, particularly in the south, were dominated by large landowners who held most of the wealth and power. The agricultural economy was based on feudal-like systems of land distribution, with poor peasant farmers working the land under harsh conditions. In contrast, industrial areas like Catalonia and the Basque Country were home to a burgeoning working class that was increasingly radicalized by Marxist and anarchist ideologies. The rise of socialism and communism in the urban working classes was seen as a direct threat by the rural elites. As industrial workers organized into unions and called for higher wages and better working conditions, the rural landowners and conservative factions feared a complete overhaul of the social order. This fear of revolution and social upheaval was a driving force behind the right-wing nationalist movement. The urban-rural divide was further complicated by regional tensions. Spain was a collection of diverse regions, each with its own distinct identity and culture. Catalonia, the Basque Country, and Galicia all had strong regional identities and often clashed with the central government in Madrid. In some cases, these regions sought greater autonomy or even independence, adding another layer of complexity to the already tense political environment. The combination of these social, political, and economic factors created a volatile environment in Spain. The rise of radical ideologies, the deep divisions between the left and right, and the role of religion all set the stage for the Spanish Civil War. The war was not simply a military conflict. It was a battle for the soul of Spain, one that would have lasting consequences for the country and the wider world. The Spanish Civil War was not just a conflict between two sides, it was a struggle between competing visions of Spain's future. Each faction involved in the war represented different ideologies, with varying goals, strategies, and visions for the nation. The two main factions, the Nationalists and the Republicans, were far from homogeneous, consisting of various groups that held disparate beliefs but were united in their fight against each other. The war was also deeply influenced by external powers, which saw the conflict as an opportunity to expand their influence in Europe. The Nationalists, led by General Francisco Franco, were a coalition of conservative, monarchist, and fascist forces. These groups came together under a common goal to protect Spain from what they saw as the growing threat of communism and anarchism. They were supported by elements of the Spanish military, landowners, and the Catholic Church, all of whom feared the revolutionary potential of the left-wing factions. The Nationalists were united by their opposition to the Republic, which they saw as a corrupt and godless institution that had strayed too far from Spain's traditional values. Franco's leadership was a key factor in the nationalist victory. As a seasoned military officer, he brought a sense of unity and discipline to the nationalist cause. Under his command, the Nationalists employed a highly organized military strategy that focused on swift, decisive victories. Franco was able to gain control of large parts of Spain, particularly in the south, where he had the support of the military and conservative elements. His forces were also bolstered by external support, most notably from Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy. Hitler's Luftwaffe provided air support, while Mussolini's forces sent troops and supplies to the Nationalists. This external aid gave Franco a significant advantage over the Republicans, whose resources were more limited. The Nationalists, however, were not a monolithic group. They were composed of various factions, each with its own vision for Spain. The monarchists, who wanted to restore the Spanish monarchy, hoped to see King Alfonso XIII return to the throne. Meanwhile, the Falange, a fascist movement founded by José Antonio Primo de Rivera, sought to establish a totalitarian state modeled on Mussolini's Italy. While Franco initially cooperated with the Falange, he ultimately sidelined them, consolidating his own power as the undisputed leader of the Nationalists. This internal tension within the nationalist camp, however, did not prevent them from presenting a united front against the Republican forces. The Republicans, on the other hand, were a loose coalition of left-wing groups, each with their own ideas for the future of Spain. The Republican side was far more ideologically diverse, ranging from moderate socialists to anarchists to communists. This diversity, while initially a strength in terms of mobilizing various segments of Spanish society, would ultimately prove to be one of the Republicans' greatest weaknesses. The lack of cohesion among the various factions made it difficult for them to present a unified strategy, which was one of the reasons they struggled against the more organized nationalist forces. At the core of the Republican faction were the socialists and communists, who sought to radically transform Spain's political and economic systems. They envisioned a socialist Spain where the working class would have greater control over the means of production and wealth would be more evenly distributed. The anarchists, particularly those from Catalonia, had a different vision, advocating for a stateless, self-managed society based on worker cooperatives and direct democracy. These anarchists were deeply distrustful of centralized state power, including that of the Republicans themselves. This ideological divide within the Republican camp led to tensions, particularly after the Soviet Union began to exert influence over the Republican government in the form of the Comintern and the arrival of Soviet advisors and military aid. Another key player on the Republican side was the Basque country, which had long sought greater autonomy or independence from Spain. The Basques were generally aligned with the left-wing forces, but their motivations were often more focused on regional independence than on broader social change. The Basque Nationalist Party supported the Republic, but their primary goal was to secure greater autonomy for their region, something that put them at odds with both the nationalists and the central Republican government. The Republicans also received support from abroad, though it was not as substantial as that received by the nationalists. The Soviet Union, ideologically aligned with the communists, sent weapons, military advisors, and even troops to assist the Republican forces. However, this support came with strings attached. The Soviets sought to ensure that the Spanish Republicans adhered to their vision of a socialist revolution, often at the expense of the other left-wing factions, particularly the anarchists. This created significant tensions within the Republican camp, as the anarchists saw the Soviet influence as a form of authoritarianism. In addition to Soviet aid, the Republicans were also bolstered by the International Brigades, a group of volunteers from various countries who came to Spain to fight against fascism. These brigades were made up of individuals from all walks of life, workers, intellectuals, and anti-fascist activists. Many of them were inspired by the Spanish Republic's fight against fascism and saw it as part of a broader struggle against the rise of authoritarian regimes in Europe. While the International Brigades were a symbol of global solidarity, they were not able to turn the tide of the war. The Republican forces were ill-equipped and poorly organized, and despite the bravery of the volunteers, the Republicans struggled to hold off the nationalists. The war itself was characterized by a series of brutal, often indecisive battles. The nationalists, with their superior resources and more unified leadership, gradually gained the upper hand. They employed a strategy of rapid offensives, hoping to break through the Republican lines and capture key cities. The Republicans, in contrast, often relied on defensive tactics, hoping to stall the nationalists long enough to gain foreign support or for internal divisions to weaken the enemy. This strategy of attrition, however, was not enough to overcome the nationalists' superior firepower and organization.
One of the most significant battles of the war was the Battle of Madrid, which took place from November 1936 to March 1937. Madrid was the capital of the Republic, and its fall would have been a devastating blow to the Republican cause. The nationalists laid siege to the city, but the Republicans were able to hold out with the help of reinforcements, including the International Brigades. The battle was marked by fierce fighting, with both sides suffering heavy casualties. The nationalists, however, were unable to break through, and Madrid remained under Republican control for the duration of the war. Another important front in the war was in the Basque country, where the nationalists launched a series of offensives to capture the region. The Basques fought fiercely to defend their territory, but they were ultimately overwhelmed. In April 1937, the nationalists carried out the infamous bombing of Guernica, a small Basque town, using German bombers in support of Franco's forces. The attack, which killed hundreds of civilians and destroyed much of the town, became one of the most iconic images of the war. It also served as a powerful symbol of the brutality of the nationalists and the war's devastating impact on civilian populations. Despite these victories, the nationalist strategy of slow, methodical offensives ultimately wore down the Republican forces. By 1939, Franco's forces had gained control of almost all of Spain. The Republicans, exhausted and divided, were unable to mount a significant defense. In April 1939, Madrid fell, and the war came to an end.
The Nationalists' victory in the Spanish Civil War marked the beginning of a long period of military dictatorship under Franco. The war had profound consequences not only for Spain, but for Europe as a whole. It was a precursor to the rise of fascism in the 1930s and served as a training ground for the tactics and strategies that would later be used in World War II. The war also had a lasting impact on Spanish society, with deep divisions between the victorious nationalists and the defeated Republicans that would persist for decades. The legacy of the Spanish Civil War remains contentious to this day, as Spain continues to grapple with the memory of a conflict that shaped its modern history. The aftermath of the Spanish Civil War was marked by profound and lasting consequences that reverberated through Spain and beyond. The victory of the nationalists under Francisco Franco not only ended the war but also set the stage for a brutal, authoritarian regime that would dominate the country for nearly 4 decades. The impact of the war was felt in every corner of Spanish society, from the political landscape to the cultural fabric, and its legacy continues to shape Spain's identity today. Franco's victory in 1939 brought an end to the Republican resistance and allowed him to consolidate power. The immediate consequence of this victory was the establishment of a military dictatorship that lasted until Franco's death in The Nationalists, having secured their hold over Spain, implemented a series of harsh measures to suppress any dissent and enforce their vision of a unified conservative Spain. The war had not only been a battle between ideologies, but a clash of social orders, and the victors were determined to reshape Spain according to their conservative and authoritarian ideals. The first step in Franco's consolidation of power was the creation of a totalitarian state. The war had left the country devastated, and the nationalists sought to rebuild it by eliminating any remaining opposition. The Republican factions, including communists, anarchists, and socialists, were seen as enemies of the state. Thousands of Republicans were executed, imprisoned, or exiled. In addition to the repression of political dissidents, Franco's regime also cracked down on regional languages and cultures. The Basques, Catalans, and Galicians, who had fought for autonomy during the war, were subjected to harsh measures that sought to erase their distinct identities. Regional languages were banned in public life, and any expression of separatism was brutally suppressed. Franco's government was characterized by a strict authoritarian structure, where political opposition was not tolerated, and the Catholic Church held significant influence. The Church, which had aligned itself with the nationalists during the war, was rewarded with a prominent position in the post-war state. The regime promoted conservative Catholic values, and the Church had significant control over education, social services, and public life. This close relationship between the state and the Church ensured that the Spanish people remained under the tight grip of traditionalist, often reactionary values for decades. The economic policies of Franco's regime were also shaped by the desire for self-sufficiency and autarky. During the war, Spain had relied heavily on support from Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy, and after the war, Franco sought to maintain Spain's independence from foreign influence. The regime implemented protectionist policies aimed at shielding Spain from the global market. While this approach initially helped to stabilize the country's economy, it also led to stagnation and inefficiency. Spain remained isolated from the international community for much of the early years of Franco's rule, and its economy was largely based on agriculture and industry that remained under state control. The social impact of Franco's regime was also significant. Spain became a deeply conservative Catholic society where the role of women, workers, and other marginalized groups was severely restricted. Women were expected to fulfill traditional roles as wives and mothers, and their rights were limited in many areas of public and private life. The regime also enforced strict censorship of the media, arts, and literature. Any form of dissent or criticism of the government was punishable by imprisonment or worse. Intellectuals, writers, and artists who opposed Franco were often silenced or forced into exile. The country's political and cultural expression was stifled under the authoritarian regime. Despite this repression, the regime was not without its supporters. For many Spaniards, Franco represented stability after the chaos of the Civil War. His policies helped to modernize the country in some respects, particularly in the latter years of his rule. In the 1960s, Spain began to open up to foreign investment and tourism, and the country experienced some economic growth. However, this economic growth was uneven, with many rural areas still suffering from poverty and underdevelopment. The stark contrast between the wealthy urban centers and the impoverished rural regions would be a source of tension for many years. On the international stage, Franco's regime was initially isolated. Spain was excluded from the United Nations and faced diplomatic sanctions for its support of the Axis powers during World War II. However, by the 1950s, the geopolitical landscape had shifted, and Franco was able to secure international recognition. The Cold War played a role in this shift, as the United States and other Western powers saw Franco's regime as a potential ally in the fight against communism.
In 1953, the Vatican and the United States signed agreements with Spain that provided Franco with international legitimacy and aid. This helped to stabilize the regime and solidify its grip on power. Franco's death in 1975 marked the end of an era, but the legacy of the Spanish Civil War and the dictatorship continued to shape Spain's political and social life. The transition to democracy in the late 1970s was a difficult and often contentious process. The country faced the challenge of coming to terms with its past, including the war and the repression that followed it. In 1977, Spain held its first democratic elections since the Civil War, and the Spanish Constitution of 1978 established a parliamentary democracy with a constitutional monarchy. However, the wounds of the Civil War were not easily healed, and the memory of the conflict continued to divide Spanish society. In the decades that followed, Spain grappled with how to address the legacy of the war and Franco's regime. The question of whether to hold those responsible for war crimes and political repression accountable remained contentious. Many families who had lost loved ones during the Civil War or the subsequent repression sought justice and recognition. In the 2000s, the Spanish government passed the Law of Historical Memory, which sought to address some of these issues, including the removal of symbols of Franco's regime from public spaces. Despite these efforts, the memory of the Spanish Civil War remains a deeply divisive issue in Spain, with different generations holding differing views on how to remember the past. The Spanish Civil War's impact also extended beyond Spain's borders. The war was a precursor to the larger ideological struggles of the 20th century, particularly the rise of fascism in Europe. Many saw the conflict as a microcosm of the broader struggle between fascism and communism that would dominate Europe in the years leading up to World War II. The involvement of Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy on the nationalist side, and the support of the Soviet Union for the Republicans, made the Spanish Civil War an early battleground in the global conflict between totalitarian regimes and democratic forces. The war also influenced the way the world viewed civil wars and ideological conflicts in the 20th century. The use of propaganda, the mobilization of international volunteers, and the intense ideological battles between left and right would become common features of later conflicts, such as World War II, the Cold War, and numerous other revolutionary struggles. The Spanish Civil War demonstrated the power of ideology to shape the course of history, with both sides seeing the war as a fight for the very soul of Spain and the broader struggle for the future of Europe. The trauma caused by the war and the years of dictatorship that followed left deep scars in Spanish society. The conflict was not simply a battle of arms, but a struggle that affected the lives of millions of people, reshaping families, communities, and the nation as a whole. For those who lived through it, the Spanish Civil War was a painful and defining event, one whose effects would echo across generations. Even today, the war's memory continues to shape Spain's political discourse and cultural identity.
Thank you for joining us in the War Vault. If you found this video insightful, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to explore more of history's most defining conflicts.